Hi guys, welcome to your cell membrane video notes. These notes are going to just be taking a look at the structures of the cell membrane. So first, the cell membrane is also known as something called the plasma membrane, and it's selectively permeable, meaning it allows some things in and some things out, and then there's other things that aren't allowed in whatsoever. So some of the things that might be allowed into the cell are things like nutrients. And then things that might be allowed out of the cell are things like waste. So another name for the cell membrane is also the phospholipid bilayer, but technically this name is a little bit more of a description of its structure. So there's two parts to the phospholipid bilayer. So there's the glycerol phosphate head, and then there's two fatty acid tails that make up the tail part of this phospholipid bilayer. So bilayer meaning two. So here's your two parts, and it's also important to note that one part is hydrophilic and one part is hydrophobic. So hydrophilic is water loving. So these parts of the cell membrane like water, so that's why they're on the outside. If you look down here at this picture, the tails are touching each other and the heads are facing outside because the tails are water phobic or hydrophobic, so they fear water. So they don't want to come into contact with water, and as you know, your body's made up of a lot of water, so the outside of your cell membrane is constantly in contact with water. So the fluid mosaic model is another term you might hear to describe the cell membrane. So what this just means is that many molecules are floating in the membrane. So, and by floating, they're not just kind of free to move wherever they want to, they are kind of mixed in with the cell membrane, and they do have specific locations. So examples of these molecules, you have carbohydrates, and there's two different types of attachment we'll talk about. There are 5 types of proteins, and then cholesterol. And this picture down here displays all of them. So you see these chains are all of the carbohydrates. The larger molecules are all different types of proteins. And cholesterol are these yellow little squiggles here. Those are in between the tail fibers. So let's talk about the proteins. So there's 5 proteins total, so here's 3 to start. So glycoproteins have carbohydrates attached to them. So glyco is your prefix, meaning a carbohydrate. An integral protein is found within the cell membrane. So integral meaning throughout. So these are going to be ones that span the entire top and bottom, as you see, of the cell membrane. And then you have things called peripheral proteins. And a good way to remember this is if you think about your peripheral vision, it's what you can see out of the corner of your eyes. So it's on the edges of your vision. So a peripheral protein, on the other hand, is on the edges of the cell membrane. And as you can see in this picture, they can either be free on their own, or they may be attached to another protein. The 2 other types of transport proteins are channel and carrier, and these two can get commonly confused. So a channel is just that. Think about a channel that a boat might be going through. It's kind of just a little street. It goes straight down the channel. So this example is your channel protein, but it's not open to everything. It only allows specific things to go through it. And then you also have your carrier proteins. So these ones are here, and they kind of remind me of little Pac-Mans. Because if you see, they open to the top, they take in whatever is that's passing through them, and then they open to the bottom. So they have little Pac-Man mouths. So the proteins have some functions, and it depends on the protein, which depends on the function. So the glycoproteins are for transmitting signals. So if you see here, they're attached like little antenna on the top of the cell membrane. So this helps to get cell signals from other cells. They also support the structure. So the integral proteins that go all the way through, they're helping keep that structure of the cell membrane because they are going all the way through from top to bottom. And then you also have the proteins that help with transportation. So these are going to be the ones with channels, and I've scribbled through a couple of them, but they're going to be the ones with channels, or those ones that look like little Pac-Mans that allow materials to move through them. So cholesterol, like we talked about, is in between the tails. So this is inside of the cell membrane. It doesn't go on the outside like some of the proteins do. And as you can see, there are these little chains, and all they simply do is prevent those tails from sticking together. So if you have too many tails in a row without cholesterol, they're all going to stick together, and then the function of the cell membrane isn't going to work very well. The final thing is a carbohydrate. So there are two types of carbohydrates, like I had mentioned. So the ones that are attached to a protein we already looked at. Those are called your glycoproteins. But there's also ones that are attached to just the heads of the cell membrane, and those are going to be called glycolipids. So glycoprotein attached to a protein, glycolipid attached to a lipid, which is actually the head. And as you can look down here, this one is your glycolipid. It's attached directly to the head of that phospholipid bilayer. And then you have the glycoprotein, which is attached to this big red protein here. And the function of the carbohydrates, like we mentioned briefly before, they're kind of like a signal. When you see a carbohydrate chain, kind of think of an antenna on a car. Most cars don't have them anymore, but older cars have an antenna, and this helps with signals. So the signals on a cell are via carbohydrates, and they help cells identify other cells, communicate with other cells, all sorts of different things. So let's just quickly practice labeling. You will be responsible for being able to recognize different parts of the cell membrane. So all of these purple blobs that you see are proteins. And if we look, we have our integral proteins, which go all the way through. We have peripheral proteins, which are only on the edges. And this doesn't have any of the channel or the carrier ones, but hopefully you remember what that looks like. Then you also have our carbs. So we have a glycoprotein here, which is attached to a protein. And then over here you see we have a glycolipid. And last but not least, we have all of our cholesterol within the cell membrane. And that is it for your notes.